Welcome to Stoic Vivu, where we unlock the transformational power of ancient wisdom for modern life mastery. I'm your guide on this intellectual journey, dedicated to revealing how history's greatest philosophical minds developed extraordinary intelligence that enabled them to excel in politics, literature, warfare, and practical affairs while maintaining profound wisdom and inner strength. Our mission centers on making the sophisticated learning methods of classical Stoicism immediately accessible and powerfully effective for the unique intellectual challenges you face in contemporary America. You're sitting in a bustling coffee shop in Manhattan, scrolling through endless articles and videos promising to make you smarter in record time. Your bookmark folder overflows with learning courses you've started but never finished, productivity apps that promise cognitive enhancement, and study techniques that delivered temporary improvements but no lasting transformation. Despite consuming vast amounts of information daily, you feel intellectually scattered rather than truly wise, accumulating facts without developing the deeper thinking abilities that create genuine success and satisfaction in life. This frustrating experience reveals the fundamental flaw in most modern approaches to intelligence development. Contemporary education focuses on information consumption and test performance rather than wisdom cultivation and practical judgment. We're taught to memorize rather than think, to accept rather than question, to compete rather than understand. The result is minds stuffed with data but lacking the philosophical foundation necessary for navigating complexity, making excellent decisions, and continuing to grow intellectually throughout life. 2,000 years ago, three extraordinary individuals developed systematic methods for intellectual development that transcended anything the modern world has produced. Marcus Aurelius governed the Roman Empire with unprecedented wisdom while advancing philosophical thought through his personal reflections. Seneca excelled as playwright, politician, and advisor while maintaining intellectual integrity under extreme pressure. Epictetus rose from slavery to become one of history's most respected teachers, developing reasoning abilities that enabled him to influence powerful Romans despite his humble origins. These men didn't achieve intellectual excellence through modern study techniques, productivity hacks, or quick learning formulas. Instead, they practiced what they called philosophical education, a comprehensive approach to developing the mind that treated intelligence not as a fixed capacity, but as a virtue that grows stronger through systematic cultivation of wisdom, intellectual courage, and practical judgment. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his personal meditations, "The universe is change. Our life is what our thoughts make it." This profound insight reveals that intellectual development requires more than accumulating knowledge about the external world. True intelligence involves training your mind to think clearly, question assumptions, extract wisdom from every experience, and apply learning effectively in practical situations that matter. Today's journey will reveal 8 essential principles these philosophical masters used to develop minds capable of extraordinary achievement across multiple domains. You'll discover how to ignite natural curiosity that drives lifelong learning, master the art of extracting wisdom from great texts, and develop intellectual courage that enables growth through challenging established beliefs. Most importantly, you'll learn to think with the clarity and practical wisdom that the ancient Stoics considered the highest human achievement. This isn't about becoming an academic or memorizing philosophical concepts, but rather about developing the thinking abilities that enable excellence in whatever field you choose to pursue. The intellectual methods we'll explore create better entrepreneurs, more effective leaders, wiser parents, and more thoughtful citizens who can navigate complexity with confidence and continue growing throughout their lives. 1. Awaken your inner scholar in 5 simple steps. You're walking through the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., surrounded by millions of books containing humanity's greatest discoveries, yet feeling overwhelmed rather than inspired by the vast ocean of knowledge before you. Your mind races between curiosity about countless subjects and anxiety about how little you actually understand about any of them. This moment perfectly captures what Seneca called the scholar's paradox. The more we learn about the world, the more we realize how much remains unknown. However, this apparent problem actually represents the beginning of true intellectual awakening, because genuine curiosity emerges not from confidence in what we know, but from humble recognition of what we have yet to discover. Seneca, who served as advisor to Emperor Nero while maintaining one of Rome's most impressive personal libraries, understood that intellectual curiosity isn't a personality trait you either possess or lack, but rather a capacity that can be systematically developed through what he called philosophical wonder. Writing to his friend Lucilius, Seneca explained that the mind naturally seeks understanding when properly trained, just as the body naturally seeks nourishment when healthy. The key lies in creating conditions that encourage this natural intellectual appetite rather than suppressing it through rushed learning or superficial engagement with complex topics. The first step in awakening your inner scholar involves what Marcus Aurelius practiced as assumption questioning, the systematic habit of examining beliefs and ideas that you've accepted without thorough investigation. You're sitting in a Denver coffee shop, reading an article about economic policy, when you encounter a statement that most people would simply accept or reject based on their political preferences. Instead of reacting automatically, you pause and ask yourself what assumptions underlie this claim, what evidence supports or challenges it, and what questions you would need to investigate to form a genuinely informed opinion about this topic. This questioning practice requires understanding that intellectual curiosity differs fundamentally from mere information gathering. Marcus Aurelius distinguished between the collection of facts and the pursuit of understanding, recognizing that wisdom emerges from deep engagement with ideas rather than superficial exposure to many topics. When you encounter new information, instead of immediately trying to memorize or categorize it, you begin asking questions that lead to deeper investigation and genuine comprehension. The second step employs what Epictetus called intellectual humility, the recognition that admitting ignorance represents the beginning of wisdom rather than a sign of failure or inadequacy. Most people avoid acknowledging what they don't understand because they've been conditioned to view ignorance as weakness rather than opportunity. The Stoics understood that intellectual pride prevents learning by closing the mind to new information that challenges existing beliefs or reveals gaps in current understanding. You're attending a work meeting in Chicago where colleagues discuss technical concepts that you don't fully grasp. Your natural instinct might be to nod along and pretend understanding to avoid appearing uninformed. However, applying Epictetus's principle of intellectual humility, you recognize this as a perfect opportunity to learn something genuinely valuable. You ask thoughtful questions that demonstrate your interest in understanding rather than your need to appear knowledgeable, creating opportunities for genuine learning while modeling intellectual courage for others. The third step involves what Seneca practiced as daily wonder cultivation, deliberately spending time each day focusing on questions or topics that genuinely fascinate you, regardless of their immediate practical utility. Modern life tends to channel our attention toward immediately useful information while neglecting the kind of open-ended exploration that develops intellectual creativity and keeps curiosity alive. Seneca would dedicate portions of each day to investigating questions purely because they interested him, understanding that this practice maintained his capacity for wonder and prevented his mind from becoming mechanically focused on routine concerns. This practice requires protecting time for what the Stoics called philosophical play, intellectual exploration that serves no immediate purpose beyond satisfying curiosity and expanding understanding. You might spend 30 minutes researching how birds navigate during migration, exploring the history of musical instruments, or investigating the philosophical questions that ancient cultures found compelling. The specific topic matters less than the practice of engaging your mind in exploration driven by genuine interest rather than external obligation. The fourth step employs Marcus Aurelius's method of perspective expansion, actively seeking viewpoints and sources of information that challenge your current understanding or expose you to entirely different ways of thinking about familiar topics. The emperor regularly consulted advisors with diverse backgrounds and conflicting opinions before making important decisions, understanding that intellectual growth requires exposure to ideas that stretch rather than confirm existing mental frameworks. You're researching a topic you care about deeply, and you discover sources that present evidence conflicting with your current beliefs about this subject. Instead of dismissing these sources or seeking information that confirms your existing views, you engage with challenging perspectives as opportunities to test and refine your understanding. This practice develops what Epictetus called philosophical courage, the strength to follow evidence and reasoning, even when they lead to uncomfortable conclusions or require abandoning comfortable beliefs. The fifth step involves what Seneca called reflection integration, regularly reviewing what you've learned and connecting new information to existing knowledge in ways that deepen understanding rather than simply adding to your collection of facts. True learning occurs not when you've memorized information, but when you've integrated it into a coherent framework that helps you understand other related topics and apply insights in practical situations. This integration practice requires spending time thinking about connections between different ideas, questioning how new learning changes your understanding of previously studied topics, and considering how various concepts relate to your direct experience and practical concerns. You might spend evening time reflecting on how today's learning connects to yesterday's insights, what questions have emerged from your recent studies, and how new understanding might influence your decisions and actions. Ultimately, awakening your inner scholar means transforming from a passive consumer of information into an active seeker of wisdom who approaches learning with systematic curiosity, intellectual humility, and commitment to understanding rather than mere accumulation of facts. 2. Read like the greatest minds in history. You're sitting in a bookstore in Portland, holding a volume that promises to change your perspective on an important topic, yet you feel uncertain about how to extract genuine value from the hundreds of pages before you. Your past reading experiences have been frustratingly superficial. You consume the words, remember a few interesting points for a few days, then find that most of the content has disappeared from your memory without leaving any lasting impact on your thinking or decision-making. This common frustration reveals that most people never learned how to read in the way that Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, and Epictetus approach texts, as active dialogues with great minds rather than passive absorption of information. Marcus Aurelius, who maintained an extensive personal library while governing the Roman Empire, developed what he called conversational reading, treating every text as an opportunity for intellectual dialogue with its author across time and space. The emperor understood that books represent more than repositories of information. They provide access to the thinking processes of exceptional individuals who have grappled with similar challenges and questions. When Marcus Aurelius read philosophical texts, historical accounts, or practical treatises, he engaged with them as if he were sitting across from the author, asking questions, testing arguments, and applying insights to his own circumstances and responsibilities. This approach requires understanding the fundamental difference between what the Stoics called surface reading and philosophical reading. Surface reading involves moving your eyes across words and sentences, absorbing facts and ideas in the sequence the author presents them. Philosophical reading involves active engagement with the author's thinking process, questioning assumptions, examining evidence, and considering how insights apply to your own life and circumstances. Marcus Aurelius demonstrated this approach throughout his Meditations, where he frequently references other thinkers while developing his own philosophical insights through careful consideration of their ideas. The first element of reading, like the greatest minds, involves what Seneca practiced as preparatory reflection, spending time before reading to clarify what you hope to gain from engaging with a particular text. Most people approach books with vague intentions like learning something interesting or getting smarter, but these unfocused goals produce unfocused results. Seneca would identify specific questions he wanted to explore, problems he hoped to solve, or areas where he sought greater understanding before opening any text. You're preparing to read a book about leadership while sitting in your Seattle apartment. Instead of immediately diving into the first chapter, you spend several minutes reflecting on your current leadership challenges, questions you have about motivating teams, and specific situations where you could apply better leadership principles. This preparation creates what Seneca called the receptive mind, a mental state actively seeking relevant insights rather than passively consuming whatever the author chooses to present. The second element involves what Epictetus taught as active questioning, engaging with texts by constantly asking questions about the author's arguments, evidence, and reasoning. This practice transforms reading from passive reception into active intellectual exercise that strengthens your thinking abilities while deepening your understanding of the material. When the author makes a claim, you ask what evidence supports this assertion. When they present an argument, you consider potential objections or alternative explanations. When they offer advice, you explore how it might apply to your specific circumstances. This questioning approach requires understanding that disagreeing with an author or finding flaws in their reasoning represents productive reading rather than failure to appreciate their wisdom. Marcus Aurelius frequently questioned and refined ideas from his philosophical influences, using their insights as starting points for his own thinking rather than final authorities to accept without examination. The goal isn't to tear down every argument, but to engage thoughtfully with ideas in ways that develop your own reasoning abilities. The third element employs what Marcus Aurelius called synthesis thinking, actively connecting ideas from your current reading to knowledge you've gained from other sources, personal experiences, and practical challenges you face in daily life. This practice prevents learning from remaining isolated in separate mental compartments and instead builds integrated understanding that influences how you think about multiple topics and situations. You're reading about ancient military strategy while commuting through Los Angeles, and you begin connecting tactical principles to project management challenges you face at work. The author's discussion of resource allocation reminds you of insights from an economics book you read last month, while their emphasis on adaptability connects to personal experiences navigating unexpected changes in your career. This synthesis process creates what Marcus Aurelius called living knowledge, understanding that actively influences your thinking and decision-making rather than remaining abstract information. The fourth element involves what Seneca practiced as implementation planning, regularly pausing during reading to consider how you might apply specific insights to improve your thinking, relationships, or practical effectiveness. The Stoics understood that knowledge without application remains incomplete, and that true learning occurs when ideas influence behavior and decision-making in beneficial ways. This implementation practice requires honest self-assessment about areas where new insights challenge your current habits, beliefs, or approaches to common situations. When you encounter an idea that resonates with you, instead of simply appreciating its cleverness, you consider specific ways you might test or apply this insight in your actual circumstances. You might identify particular relationships where you could practice better listening, work situations where you could apply more strategic thinking, or personal habits where you could implement more disciplined approaches. The fifth element encompasses what all three Stoic masters practiced as reflective review, returning to important passages and ideas multiple times to deepen understanding and extract insights that weren't apparent during initial reading. Great texts reveal different layers of meaning as your experience and understanding develop, making rereading a form of continuing education rather than mere repetition. Ultimately, reading like the greatest minds in history means transforming books from entertainment or information sources into intellectual training partners that develop your thinking abilities while providing practical wisdom for navigating life's complexities with greater skill and understanding. 3. Build courage to challenge any belief. You're standing in a conference room in downtown San Francisco, listening to a presentation that contains claims you've always accepted as obviously true, when suddenly you recognize that you've never actually examined the evidence supporting these beliefs. Your mind begins to race with uncomfortable questions. What if this widely accepted idea is actually incorrect? What if challenging this belief makes you look foolish or alienates you from colleagues who share these assumptions? This moment of intellectual vertigo reveals exactly why Epictetus considered what he called philosophical courage the most essential virtue for anyone seeking genuine understanding rather than comfortable illusions. Epictetus, who transformed from slave to respected teacher through systematic development of intellectual bravery, understood that the greatest obstacles to learning aren't external barriers like lack of access to information, but internal resistances created by our attachment to existing beliefs and our fear of discovering that we've been wrong about important topics. The philosopher taught that true intellectual freedom requires what he called the courage of questions, the willingness to examine any belief, no matter how fundamental or widely accepted, when evidence or reasoning suggests it might be incomplete or incorrect. This intellectual courage emerges from understanding the fundamental difference between beliefs that serve you and beliefs that limit you, regardless of whether they happen to be popular or comfortable. Marcus Aurelius, governing an empire built on countless traditional assumptions about power, religion, and social organization, regularly questioned established ideas when his experience or reasoning suggested they might not serve the common good. The emperor understood that intellectual growth requires what he called philosophical independence, the capacity to think for yourself even when your conclusions differ from prevailing opinions. The development of belief-challenging courage begins with what Seneca practiced as assumption archaeology, systematically excavating the foundations of your current beliefs to understand how they developed and what evidence actually supports them. Most people inherit their core beliefs from family, culture, education, and social environment without ever examining whether these inherited ideas accurately reflect reality or serve their best interests. Seneca taught that intellectual maturity requires taking responsibility for your own beliefs by subjecting them to careful examination. You're reviewing your assumptions about career success while walking through Central Park in New York, and you realize that many of your beliefs about what constitutes professional achievement came from messages you absorbed during childhood and adolescence rather than careful consideration of what actually creates satisfaction and meaning in work. The belief that higher income automatically produces greater happiness, for example, might deserve investigation through examining evidence about the relationship between wealth and well-being rather than accepting this assumption simply because it's widely shared in your social environment. This archaeological process requires understanding that questioning beliefs doesn't necessarily mean rejecting them, but rather ensuring that you hold them for good reasons rather than mere habit or social pressure. Marcus Aurelius frequently examined his own beliefs about duty, virtue, and governance, not because he wanted to abandon his principles, but because he wanted to ensure that his commitments rested on solid foundations rather than unexamined assumptions inherited from his culture and education. The second phase of developing intellectual courage involves what Epictetus called evidence examination. Learning to distinguish between different types of support for various beliefs and developing comfort with uncertainty when evidence is incomplete or conflicting. Many people struggle with belief revision because they've been conditioned to view uncertainty as weakness rather than intellectual honesty, leading them to cling to questionable beliefs rather than admitting that some important questions don't have clear answers. You're researching different approaches to health and nutrition in your Denver home, and you discover that expert opinions conflict significantly on topics you assumed had been definitively settled by scientific research. Instead of feeling frustrated by this uncertainty, you apply Epictetus's approach by examining the quality of evidence supporting different positions while remaining comfortable with the reality that your understanding of optimal nutrition will continue evolving as new research emerges, and your personal experience provides additional data. The third phase employs what Marcus Aurelius practiced as perspective seeking, actively exposing yourself to viewpoints and arguments that challenge your current beliefs, especially on topics where you feel most confident about your understanding. The emperor regularly consulted advisors with different backgrounds and conflicting opinions precisely because he understood that intellectual growth requires engagement with ideas that stretch your thinking rather than confirming what you already believe. This perspective-seeking practice requires developing what Seneca called intellectual humility, recognizing that intelligent, well-informed people can examine the same evidence and reach different conclusions about complex topics. Instead of viewing disagreement as evidence that others are ignorant or dishonest, you begin to see conflicting viewpoints as opportunities to test your own reasoning and discover blind spots in your thinking. The fourth phase involves what all three Stoic masters practiced as experimental thinking, approaching belief revision as a form of intellectual experimentation where you test new ideas by considering how they might change your understanding of related topics and influence your practical decisions. This experimental approach reduces the anxiety associated with belief change by framing it as exploration rather than final judgment. You're considering whether some of your political beliefs might benefit from revision while sitting in a coffee shop in Austin, and instead of immediately defending your current positions or wholesale abandoning them, you approach this as an intellectual experiment. You ask yourself what evidence might change your mind about specific policy questions, how alternative viewpoints might address concerns you hadn't previously considered, and what practical implications different political philosophies might have for addressing real-world problems. Ultimately, Building courage to challenge any belief means developing the intellectual strength to prioritize truth-seeking over comfort maintenance, creating what Epictetus called the fearless mind that grows stronger through honest examination of its own assumptions and limitations. 4. Turn every mistake into lasting wisdom. You're walking out of a client meeting in downtown Chicago, feeling the sting of a presentation that went completely wrong. You misread your audience, fumbled key points, and watched potential opportunities slip away due to preparation errors you could have easily avoided. Your natural instinct is to replay the disaster repeatedly in your mind, focusing on embarrassment and self-criticism rather than extracting value from this painful experience. This common response to failure represents exactly what Marcus Aurelius called the waste of suffering, allowing difficulties to damage you twice, once through the original setback and again through unconstructive rumination that produces regret rather than wisdom. Marcus Aurelius, who faced military defeats, political setbacks, and personal tragedies throughout his reign as Roman emperor, developed what he called the alchemy of experience, a systematic method for transforming every mistake and failure into permanent intellectual and practical wisdom. The emperor understood that setbacks become either sources of lasting strength or causes of ongoing weakness, depending entirely on how you process and learn from them. Writing in his private journal, he reflected that the impediment to action advances action, and what stands in the way becomes the way, recognizing that obstacles provide unique educational opportunities unavailable through success alone. This transformational approach begins with understanding the fundamental difference between what the Stoics called simple failure and educational failure. Simple failure occurs when you experience a setback, feel bad about it, and continue with unchanged thinking and behavior patterns that make similar mistakes likely in the future. Educational failure involves the same initial setback, but follows a completely different processing pathway that extracts maximum learning value while building resilience and capability for handling future challenges more effectively. The first step in this wisdom extraction process involves what Seneca practiced as dispassionate analysis, examining your mistakes with the same objective curiosity you might bring to studying someone else's errors or investigating historical case studies. This analytical approach requires temporarily setting aside emotional reactions like shame, anger, or disappointment in order to understand what actually happened, why it happened, and what alternative approaches might have produced better outcomes. You're sitting in your Seattle apartment the evening after that failed presentation, and instead of continuing to berate yourself for the mistakes, you begin applying Seneca's dispassionate analysis method. You systematically review each phase of the presentation process, from initial preparation through final delivery, identifying specific decision points where different choices might have led to better results. This investigation reveals that your preparation focused too heavily on content development while neglecting audience research, and that your nervous energy during delivery prevented you from reading nonverbal feedback that could have guided real-time adjustments. This analytical approach requires understanding that mistakes usually result from multiple contributing factors rather than single dramatic errors, making thorough investigation essential for extracting complete lessons. Seneca taught that hasty analysis often identifies superficial causes while missing deeper patterns that created the conditions for failure. The presentation didn't fail simply because you felt nervous, but because insufficient preparation created a situation where nervousness could undermine your performance in specific ways. The second step employs what Epictetus called principle extraction, identifying the broader lessons and transferable insights that emerge from careful analysis of specific mistakes. While the details of each failure are unique, the underlying principles often apply to multiple areas of life and can prevent similar problems across different contexts. This principle extraction process transforms isolated mistakes into systematic learning that improves your judgment and decision-making capabilities. From your presentation analysis, you extract several transferable principles that apply beyond public speaking situations. The importance of understanding your audience before attempting to influence them applies to sales conversations, written communications, and even personal relationships. The lesson about preparing for various scenarios rather than assuming optimal conditions applies to project planning, financial decisions, and career strategy. The insight about monitoring feedback during important interactions applies to negotiations, team meetings, and conflict resolution. The third step involves what Marcus Aurelius practiced as character integration, deliberately considering how this failure experience can contribute to developing virtues like wisdom, courage, patience, and resilience. The emperor understood that setbacks provide intensive training opportunities for building character strengths that serve you throughout life, making temporary failures into permanent gains when processed correctly. Your presentation failure becomes an opportunity to practice intellectual humility by acknowledging knowledge gaps without defensive self-justification. It develops courage by requiring you to face uncomfortable truths about your preparation habits and performance abilities. It builds resilience by proving that you can survive professional setbacks without catastrophic consequences. These character developments have value far beyond their application to future presentations. The fourth step encompasses what Seneca called systematic improvement, translating insights from failure analysis into specific changes in your thinking, preparation, and execution processes. This implementation phase transforms understanding into practical capability by creating new habits and approaches that reduce the likelihood of similar mistakes while improving your overall effectiveness. Based on your presentation analysis, you develop new preparation protocols that include audience research, scenario planning, and practice sessions with feedback from trusted colleagues. You create systems for monitoring audience response during presentations and protocols for adjusting your approach when initial strategies aren't working effectively. These systematic improvements transform a painful failure into enhanced professional capability. Ultimately, turning every mistake into lasting wisdom means developing what Marcus Aurelius called the learning mind, that approaches setbacks as educational investments rather than simple losses, creating cumulative wisdom that makes you more effective and resilient over time. 5. Think with crystal clear logic every time. You're sitting in a heated team meeting in downtown Dallas, listening to colleagues present conflicting solutions to a critical business problem. Each person offers compelling arguments supported by data and experience, yet their conclusions contradict each other completely. As opinions fly around the conference table, you feel your own thinking becoming muddied by competing claims, emotional appeals, and logical fallacies disguised as reasonable arguments. This moment of intellectual confusion represents exactly when you need what Epictetus called the discipline of logic, a systematic approach to clear thinking that enabled ancient Stoics to navigate complex decisions with remarkable precision, even under intense pressure and uncertainty. Epictetus, who developed his logical methods while teaching in one of Rome's most respected philosophical schools, understood that clear thinking isn't a talent some people naturally possess while others lack. but rather a learnable skill that improves dramatically through systematic practice. The philosopher observed that most mental confusion results not from lack of intelligence, but from failure to apply consistent logical principles when evaluating information, arguments, and decisions. He taught his students what he called the architecture of reasoning, a structured approach to thinking that produces reliable clarity regardless of the complexity or emotional intensity of the situation. The foundation of crystal-clear logic begins with understanding what Marcus Aurelius practiced as premise examination, the habit of identifying and evaluating the basic assumptions underlying any argument or decision before considering evidence or reaching conclusions. Most people skip this crucial step and jump directly to debating details without ensuring that everyone shares a common understanding of fundamental premises. This creates intellectual chaos where participants argue past each other because they're operating from different unstated assumptions about the nature of the problem they're attempting to solve. During that business meeting in Dallas, instead of immediately taking sides in the solution debate, you apply Marcus Aurelius's premise examination by asking what assumptions each proposal makes about customer behavior, market conditions, available resources, and success metrics. This investigation reveals that colleagues are advocating different strategies partly because they're making different assumptions about these foundational questions, and that resolving the premise differences might eliminate much of the apparent disagreement about tactical approaches. This premise examination requires understanding the difference between stated arguments and underlying assumptions that make those arguments seem logical to their advocates. Seneca taught that intellectual clarity emerges when you learn to identify not just what people are arguing, but why their arguments make sense from their particular perspective based on their foundational beliefs and assumptions. The second element of logical clarity involves what Epictetus called evidence evaluation, systematically assessing the quality, relevance, and completeness of information being used to support various conclusions. Most people treat all evidence as equally valuable and fail to distinguish between different types of support for different kinds of claims. This creates mental confusion where weak evidence for important claims gets weighted equally with strong evidence for minor points. You're researching investment options while sitting in your San Francisco apartment, and you encounter multiple sources offering conflicting advice about market strategies. Instead of feeling overwhelmed by contradictory information, you apply Epictetus's evidence evaluation method by categorizing different types of claims and assessing what kind of evidence would be required to support each category appropriately. Historical performance data carries different logical weight than theoretical predictions, while expert opinions deserve different consideration than statistical projections. This evidence evaluation process requires developing what Marcus Aurelius called intellectual discrimination, the ability to recognize that different types of questions require different types of evidence and reasoning approaches. Questions about historical facts demand a different logical treatment than questions about future possibilities, while questions about personal values require different reasoning processes than questions about objective measurements. The third element employs what Seneca practiced as logical sequence construction, organizing your thinking process in systematic steps that build from fundamental premises through evidence evaluation to logical conclusions. This structured approach prevents the mental jumping around that creates confusion and helps you identify exactly where logical problems occur when your reasoning leads to unsatisfactory conclusions. When evaluating those investment options, you construct a logical sequence that begins with clarifying your financial goals and risk tolerance, proceeds through systematic evaluation of different investment categories based on relevant criteria, and concludes with specific decisions that logically follow from your analysis. This sequence makes your reasoning transparent and allows you to identify and correct logical errors rather than relying on intuitive feelings that might be influenced by irrelevant factors. The fourth element involves what all three Stoic masters practiced as bias recognition, systematically identifying ways that emotional preferences, social pressures, and cognitive shortcuts might be distorting your logical analysis. Clear thinking requires acknowledging that human minds naturally seek information that confirms existing beliefs while avoiding information that challenges comfortable assumptions. Marcus Aurelius regularly examined his own thinking for what he called logical distortions, recognizing that even intelligent, well-educated people routinely make reasoning errors when their emotions or interests are involved. The emperor developed the habit of asking himself whether his conclusions would seem equally logical if they supported outcomes he didn't personally prefer. The fifth element encompasses what Epictetus taught as conclusion testing, deliberately seeking ways to challenge and verify your logical conclusions before committing to important decisions or actions. This testing process involves considering alternative explanations for your evidence, imagining how your reasoning might be wrong, and seeking input from people who might identify logical flaws you've overlooked. Ultimately, thinking with crystal clear logic every time means developing systematic habits of premise examination, evidence evaluation, logical sequencing, bias recognition, and conclusion testing that enable reliable reasoning regardless of complexity, pressure, or emotional intensity. 6. Unlock hidden knowledge through deep listening. You're having coffee with a colleague in downtown Boston who has been working in your industry for 20 years longer than you have. As they share insights about a challenge you're currently facing, you notice your mind racing ahead to formulate responses, prepare counterarguments, and plan what you'll say next rather than fully absorbing the wisdom they're offering. This mental multitasking, which feels productive, actually prevents you from accessing what Seneca called the hidden curriculum available in every conversation with experienced, thoughtful people. The Roman philosopher understood that most valuable knowledge doesn't come through formal education or reading, but through deep attention to what others reveal about their thinking processes, problem-solving methods, and hard-won insights. Seneca, who learned as much from his conversations with merchants, soldiers, and craftsmen as from his formal philosophical studies, developed what he called the art of intellectual receptivity, a systematic approach to listening that transforms every interaction into a learning opportunity. Writing to his friend Lucilius, Seneca explained that most people miss the majority of wisdom available to them because they approach conversations as competitions to demonstrate their own knowledge rather than opportunities to acquire understanding they don't yet possess. This listening approach requires understanding the fundamental difference between what the Stoics called defensive listening and acquisitive listening. Defensive listening involves monitoring what others say primarily to identify points where you can demonstrate your own knowledge, correct their mistakes, or defend your existing beliefs from challenge. Acquisitive listening involves approaching conversations with genuine curiosity about what others understand that you don't, how they've solved problems you haven't encountered, and what perspectives they've developed through experiences different from your own. The transformation begins with what Marcus Aurelius practiced as ego suspension, temporarily setting aside your need to appear knowledgeable or impressive in order to focus completely on understanding what others are actually communicating. The emperor understood that intellectual pride creates a mental barrier that prevents learning from people who might have valuable insights but express them in ways that don't immediately align with your existing knowledge or preferred communication styles. During that coffee conversation in Boston, instead of planning your response while your colleague speaks, You apply Marcus Aurelius's ego suspension by focusing entirely on understanding their perspective before considering your own contribution to the discussion. You notice details about how they analyze problems, what factors they consider most important, and what experiences shaped their current thinking. This shift in attention reveals insights about industry dynamics and problem-solving approaches that you would have missed while preparing your own comments. This ego suspension requires recognizing that appearing temporarily ignorant or confused serves your learning goals better than maintaining an image of constant competence. Epictetus taught that intellectual growth requires accepting the discomfort of not knowing things that others understand, viewing this ignorance as an opportunity rather than embarrassment. The second element involves what Seneca called question archaeology, learning to hear not just what people explicitly state, but also the underlying questions, concerns, and assumptions that shape their expressed thoughts. Most valuable insights emerge not from surface-level statements, but from understanding the deeper thinking processes that produce those statements. When someone offers advice about handling a difficult client, for example, their specific suggestions matter less than understanding how they think about client relationships, what they've learned from similar situations, and what principles guide their approach to professional challenges. You're listening to a mentor discuss career strategy while walking through Central Park in New York, and instead of focusing only on their specific recommendations, you pay attention to how they think about career development, what factors they consider when evaluating opportunities, and what experiences taught them to prioritize certain considerations over others. This deeper listening reveals a framework for thinking about career decisions that proves more valuable than any specific advice about your current situation. This archaeological listening requires developing what Marcus Aurelius called pattern recognition, the ability to identify recurring themes, underlying principles, and thinking methods that appear across different topics and conversations with the same person. These patterns often reveal more about effective approaches to complex challenges than isolated pieces of advice or information. The third element employs what Epictetus taught as empathetic reasoning, temporarily adopting other people's perspectives and assumptions to understand how their conclusions make sense from their particular viewpoint and experience. This practice doesn't require agreeing with everything others believe, but rather developing the capacity to understand why intelligent, experienced people might reach different conclusions than you would when analyzing similar situations. When your colleague explains why they handle client relationships differently from you do, instead of immediately judging their approach as better or worse than yours, you temporarily adopt their perspective to understand what experiences and priorities make their method logical from their viewpoint. This empathetic reasoning often reveals considerations you hadn't previously recognized and alternative approaches that might prove valuable in different circumstances. The fourth element involves what all three Stoic masters practiced as synthesis integration, actively connecting insights from conversations to knowledge you've gained from other sources, personal experiences, and ongoing challenges you face in your professional and personal life. This integration process transforms isolated pieces of conversational wisdom into a coherent understanding that influences how you think about multiple situations and decisions. Ultimately, unlocking hidden knowledge through deep listening means approaching every conversation as a potential source of wisdom while developing the attention skills and intellectual humility necessary to extract maximum learning value from interactions with people who possess different experiences and perspectives from your own. 7. Solve complex problems using ancient logic. You're staring at your laptop screen in a Denver coffee shop, overwhelmed by a multifaceted business challenge that seems to have no clear solution. Budget constraints conflict with quality requirements, stakeholder demands contradict each other, and every potential approach creates new problems while solving others. Your mind feels paralyzed by the complexity, jumping between different aspects of the problem without making meaningful progress toward resolution. This intellectual gridlock represents exactly the type of situation where Marcus Aurelius applied what he called systematic deconstruction, a methodical approach to breaking down overwhelming challenges into manageable components that can be addressed through sequential logical analysis. Marcus Aurelius, who faced problems of staggering complexity while governing 60 million people across vast territories, developed sophisticated problem-solving methods that enabled him to navigate situations where multiple competing interests, limited resources, and uncertain outcomes created seemingly impossible decisions. The emperor understood that complex problems appear unsolvable primarily because human minds struggle to process multiple variables simultaneously, leading to mental confusion rather than analytical clarity. His approach involved transforming overwhelming complexity into systematic sequences of simpler decisions that could be addressed through clear reasoning. The psychological principle underlying this ancient method relates to what modern cognitive scientists call cognitive load theory, though Marcus Aurelius understood this concept through philosophical observation. The human mind can only maintain conscious attention on a limited number of variables at once, and complex problems typically involve more factors than our working memory can handle effectively. When we attempt to solve everything simultaneously, our thinking becomes scattered and ineffective. The Stoic approach deliberately reduces cognitive load by addressing complexity through systematic progression rather than simultaneous analysis. The foundation of ancient logical problem-solving begins with what Epictetus called problem isolation, systematically identifying the core issue that needs resolution while distinguishing it from secondary complications that might be distracting your attention from the essential challenge. Most people struggle with complex problems because they attempt to solve everything simultaneously rather than identifying which element represents the central difficulty that, once resolved, makes other complications easier to address. In your Denver coffee shop, instead of continuing to feel overwhelmed by the interconnected challenges, you apply Epictetus's isolation method by asking yourself what single issue, if resolved successfully, would have the greatest positive impact on all other aspects of the situation. This investigation reveals that stakeholder alignment represents the core challenge, because competing demands from different parties create the constraints that make budget and quality considerations seem impossible to reconcile. This isolation process requires understanding the difference between root causes and surface symptoms, recognizing that solving fundamental issues often eliminates multiple secondary problems automatically. Seneca taught that wise problem solvers spend more time identifying the right problem to solve than developing solutions to problems that might not address the underlying difficulty. The philosopher observed that many apparent solutions fail because they address symptoms while leaving root causes unchanged, leading to recurring difficulties that seem to resist permanent resolution. The second element involves what Marcus Aurelius practiced as variable mapping, systematically identifying all factors that influence the problem while categorizing them according to how much control you have over each element. This mapping process prevents the mental spinning that occurs when you treat controllable and uncontrollable factors as equally important to your problem-solving strategy. You begin creating what Marcus Aurelius would recognize as a control analysis of your business challenge. Stakeholder personalities and individual preferences fall into the uncontrollable category, while communication methods and information presentation remain within your influence. Budget limitations might be fixed constraints, while timeline flexibility could represent a controllable variable depending on how you frame proposals and negotiate with decision makers. Market conditions and regulatory requirements typically fall into the uncontrollable category, while project scope and delivery methods often remain within your influence. This variable mapping requires developing what Epictetus called strategic acceptance, recognizing that effective problem-solving focuses energy on factors you can influence while adapting to constraints that cannot be changed, regardless of how much you might prefer different circumstances. The philosopher taught that anxiety and confusion often result from investing mental energy in attempting to control uncontrollable factors while neglecting areas where your actions could create meaningful improvements. The third element employs what Seneca called sequential analysis, approaching complex problems through logical stages that build from fundamental considerations toward specific implementation decisions. This systematic progression prevents mental jumping between different aspects of problems, which creates confusion and prevents coherent solution development. Your business challenge becomes manageable when approached through Seneca's sequential method. First, you clarify what success looks like for each stakeholder group and identify areas where their interests naturally align. Second, you develop communication strategies that emphasize shared benefits while honestly addressing unavoidable trade-offs. Third, you create implementation plans that maximize stakeholder satisfaction within realistic budget and timeline constraints. Fourth, you establish monitoring systems that allow course corrections as new information emerges during execution. This sequential approach requires understanding that complex problems rarely have perfect solutions, but usually offer workable compromises that address core needs while accepting limitations that cannot be eliminated. Marcus Aurelius regularly faced situations where every available option created disadvantages for some constituencies, requiring decisions based on overall benefit rather than universal satisfaction. The fourth element involves what all three Stoic masters practiced as solution testing, systematically examining potential approaches by considering their likely consequences, resource requirements, and alignment with fundamental principles before committing to implementation. This testing process prevents costly mistakes that occur when solutions appear attractive superficially but create new problems that outweigh their benefits. You mentally test your stakeholder alignment strategy by considering how each group might respond to different communication approaches, what objections they might raise, and how you could address their concerns while maintaining the integrity of your overall proposal. This testing reveals potential difficulties that allow you to refine your approach before implementing it in actual stakeholder conversations. The ancient logic approach culminates in what Marcus Aurelius called adaptive implementation, beginning with carefully planned actions while remaining prepared to modify your approach based on new information and unexpected developments that emerge during execution. The emperor understood that complex problems often reveal additional complications during solution implementation, requiring flexible thinking rather than rigid adherence to initial plans. Ultimately, solving complex problems using ancient logic means transforming overwhelming challenges into systematic analytical processes that enable clear thinking and effective action, even when facing situations that initially appear impossibly complicated. 8. Create a mind that never stops growing. You're reflecting on your intellectual journey while walking through Golden Gate Park in San Francisco, realizing that despite years of education and professional development, you sometimes feel like your learning has stagnated rather than accelerated with experience. The curiosity that drove you as a child seems harder to access now, replaced by routines and assumptions that make each day feel intellectually similar to the last. This recognition reveals what Seneca called the scholar's greatest danger, the gradual shift from active learning to passive maintenance that occurs when we stop treating our minds as works in progress requiring constant cultivation and deliberate development. Seneca, who continued expanding his intellectual horizons throughout his life despite achieving mastery in literature, philosophy, and political affairs, understood that the human mind naturally tends toward what he called cognitive crystallization, the process by which thinking patterns become rigid and curiosity diminishes as we accumulate knowledge and experience. The Roman philosopher observed that many intelligent people reach a plateau where they stop genuinely learning and instead spend their mental energy defending existing beliefs and reinforcing familiar thought patterns. This intellectual stagnation occurs not because people lose their capacity for growth, but because they unconsciously abandon the practices and attitudes that enable continuous learning. Seneca identified several specific shifts that mark the transition from growth-oriented to maintenance-oriented thinking, understanding that recognizing these patterns enables individuals to reverse them and restore their capacity for lifelong intellectual development. The transformation back toward continuous growth begins with what Marcus Aurelius practiced as beginner's mind cultivation, deliberately approaching familiar topics and situations as if encountering them for the first time. The emperor understood that expertise can become a barrier to learning when it creates the illusion that we fully understand subjects where significant depths remain unexplored. His private writings reveal someone who regularly questioned his own assumptions and sought new perspectives on concepts he had studied for decades. You're attending a conference in your field of expertise while visiting Chicago, and instead of listening to presentations with the critical ear of someone who already knows most of what speakers will cover, you apply Marcus Aurelius's beginner's mind approach by asking yourself what you might be missing, what assumptions you haven't examined recently, and what questions you haven't considered about familiar topics. This shift in perspective immediately reveals nuances and connections that your expert knowledge had actually been preventing you from noticing. This beginner's mind cultivation requires understanding that intellectual humility represents strength rather than weakness, and that admitting ignorance about aspects of familiar subjects opens doorways to insights that remain closed to those who believe they've achieved complete understanding. Epictetus taught that the phrase, "I don't know," should be celebrated rather than avoided, because it signals the presence of learning opportunities that confident knowledge claims tend to obscure. The second element involves what Epictetus called question evolution, systematically developing more sophisticated and penetrating questions about topics you've studied previously. The philosopher observed that intellectual growth often occurs not through finding new subjects to study, but through asking better questions about subjects you thought you already understood. This questioning evolution transforms familiar topics into sources of fresh insight and continued learning. As you deepen your expertise in your chosen field, instead of asking only practical questions about implementation and optimization, you begin exploring philosophical questions about underlying assumptions, historical questions about how current approaches developed, and speculative questions about future possibilities and alternative approaches. These evolved questions reveal dimensions of your field that a purely practical focus had left unexplored. The third element employs what Seneca practiced as cross-domain connection, deliberately seeking insights and methods from fields outside your primary areas of expertise and exploring how these external perspectives might enhance your understanding of familiar subjects. The Roman philosopher regularly drew connections between literature, politics, philosophy, and practical affairs, understanding that intellectual growth accelerates when knowledge from different domains fertilizes each other. You're studying project management techniques while sitting in your Seattle apartment, and instead of focusing exclusively on business applications, you explore how military strategists approach similar coordination challenges, how conductors manage complex orchestral performances, and how film directors coordinate multiple creative elements toward unified artistic goals. These cross-domain investigations reveal project management insights that a purely business-focused study would never uncover. This connection-making requires developing what Marcus Aurelius called intellectual courage, the willingness to explore subjects outside your comfort zone and expertise areas where you must return to a genuine beginner status. The emperor understood that intellectual growth requires regularly venturing into domains where your existing knowledge provides limited guidance, forcing you to develop new learning approaches and question assumptions that remain unexamined within familiar territories. The fourth element involves what all three Stoic masters practiced as teaching integration, regularly explaining your learning to others as a method for deepening your own understanding and identifying gaps in your knowledge that aren't apparent during private study. The ancient philosophers understood that attempting to teach forces you to organize your knowledge clearly, anticipate questions and objections, and articulate concepts in ways that reveal their essential structure. The fifth element encompasses what Seneca called future-focused learning, deliberately studying subjects and developing capabilities that you anticipate needing in future roles and circumstances, rather than limiting your intellectual development to current requirements and interests. This forward-looking approach ensures that your mind continues expanding rather than simply maintaining existing capabilities. Ultimately, creating a mind that never stops growing means establishing intellectual habits and attitudes that maintain curiosity, embrace uncertainty, seek connections across different domains of knowledge, and view learning as a lifelong adventure rather than a temporary phase of life that ends with formal education or career establishment. Forge your path to lifelong wisdom. As we reach the culmination of our exploration into ancient intellectual development, take a moment to recognize the profound transformation that lies within your grasp. You've discovered 8 powerful principles that enabled Marcus Aurelius to govern wisely while advancing philosophical thought, Seneca to excel across multiple domains while maintaining intellectual integrity, and Epictetus to rise from slavery to respected teacher through systematic cultivation of practical wisdom. These aren't merely historical curiosities, but living methods that remain as effective today as they were 2 millennia ago. You now possess the knowledge to awaken your inner scholar through systematic curiosity cultivation, transforming everyday encounters into opportunities for genuine learning and understanding. You've learned to read like the greatest minds in history, approaching texts as dialogues with exceptional thinkers rather than passive information consumption. The courage to challenge any belief will protect you from intellectual stagnation while enabling continuous growth through honest examination of your assumptions and convictions. The ancient art of turning every mistake into lasting wisdom ensures that setbacks become stepping stones rather than stumbling blocks, while crystal-clear logic provides reliable thinking methods for navigating complexity and uncertainty. Deep listening skills unlock hidden knowledge available in every conversation, and systematic problem-solving approaches enable you to address challenges that once seemed overwhelming. Most importantly, you've learned to create a mind that never stops growing, maintaining intellectual vitality throughout your entire life. These principles work synergistically, each one strengthening the others to create comprehensive intellectual development that goes far beyond academic achievement or professional competence. The wisdom cultivation we've explored enables better decision-making, deeper relationships, more creative problem solving, and greater satisfaction in both work and personal pursuits. When you consistently apply these ancient methods, you join a tradition of lifelong learners who understand that intellectual development represents both personal fulfillment and meaningful contribution to the world. Remember that wisdom develops through consistent practice rather than sporadic effort. Marcus Aurelius built his intellectual strength through decades of daily reflection and systematic study. Seneca maintained his learning momentum by treating every experience as educational opportunity. Epictetus developed his teaching abilities by continuously refining his understanding of fundamental principles. Your transformation will follow the same pattern of patient, persistent cultivation. Start tomorrow with the beginner's mind approach to familiar challenges. Apply the evidence evaluation methods to important decisions you're facing, and practice deep listening in your next meaningful conversation. Each small application of these principles contributes to cumulative intellectual development that will serve you throughout your life while enabling you to help others navigate their own learning journeys. The ancient Stoics understood that individual wisdom development contributes to collective human flourishing. When you become a clearer thinker, more curious learner, and wiser decision maker, you create positive ripple effects that benefit everyone around you. Your commitment to these practices extends beyond personal development to represent meaningful service to your community and future generations. As you continue forging your path to lifelong wisdom, remember that Stoic Vivu is here to support your intellectual journey with practical guidance rooted in history's greatest philosophical traditions. If this exploration has provided valuable insights for developing authentic intelligence, please subscribe to our channel where we continue revealing ancient wisdom for contemporary success. Hit the like button to help others discover these transformational methods, and share this content with anyone who could benefit from unlocking their true intellectual potential through time-tested Stoic principles. The path to wisdom begins with your very next question, your next conversation, your next opportunity to apply ancient methods to modern challenges.